Before you make any assumptions about this video based on its title, I ask that you hear me out until the end. Not only might you learn a little something about game design in Hypixel Skyblock as a whole, we'll also be going back nearly 2 years in the game's history, all to explain how the Hyperion ruined Hypixel Skyblock. Before we get too far into the story time of this video, I want to quickly mention that at 30,000 subscribers, I'll be giving away 300 million coins, so if you want a chance to win, don't forget to subscribe and join my Discord server using the link in the description. To fully understand how the Hyperion could have ruined Hypixel Skyblock, we need to understand a few concepts, the first of which has been ubiquitous within video games for as long as video games have been around, really, and that is a concept known as power creep. You've probably heard the term power creep thrown around before by creators or people within the community, but you might not know exactly what it means or where it first became a problem in gaming. And to explain that, I need to take us back to when Dungeons & Dragons and Magic the Gathering were receiving their very first expansions. In essence, power creep is the process in which new content released in a game outperforms and strips the old content of its former glory, making it practically useless over an extended period of time. You see, the issue is, power creep is a problem that is almost inherent to games that receive frequent updates. This was best exemplified in Magic the Gathering, a game which to play you had to buy cards that costed real-world money. If a new expansion were released that didn't have cards that were either more powerful or significantly more interesting to play with than old expansions, there would never be a reason for players to buy the new cards. For a company that needs to make money, if players don't buy new cards, then the company doesn't really turn a profit. Meaning that in order to be able to stay afloat as a company, they needed to release cards that were either more interesting or more powerful than old ones. At the beginning, this problem isn't so bad. They can just release cards that are more interesting to play with and are more fun. But as time goes on and game designers run out of ideas, instead of designing more interesting gameplay, they just have to design better and better items or cards that can outperform the old ones. The problem is, it's not really the game designer's fault. In order for a game to survive, there has to be players who are interested in it, and that often means releasing new updates that players will actually play. If players don't want to play the new update because it's not worth it for them, then why would they? This means that over time, items or cards or champions or heroes will become more and more powerful unless there is something actively done to stop it. While this problem tends to be seen worst in competitive games, and especially trading card games like Hearthstone and Magic the Gathering, it is everywhere, and Hypixel Skyblock was no escapee. Now that we've covered the problem endemic to nearly all video games these days, we need to talk about Skyblock, and its very first months. When the Skyblock was first released, like many other RPGs, it had a progression through the game. There was very early game armor, mid-game armor, and late-game armor. Over time, as new armor sets were released, most of the time they just added on to what was possible. And this wasn't really a huge issue. The issue with RPGs and power creep is a very different one from the trading card games. It's a challenge of how to balance content between early and late game players. This problem is perfectly exemplified in the original End Update. The original End Update was released on August 2nd of 2019, a little under 2 months after the game's release. This meant that although the items were originally only accessible to the very top end of players, over time it really meant that everybody could access them within 2 months. Nobody had been playing for longer than 2 months when the End Update released, because the game hadn't been out for that long, so the balance between early and late game players was very small. We recently passed the 2-year anniversary of the End Update's release, meaning that should the admins want to add items that would only be accessible by those who have been playing since the very beginning, it would take a new player over 2 years to be able to get to these new items, and that's just not reasonable. That right there is the issue with RPG power creep. It's not that items or heroes get more powerful over time, it's that players do. The players are the issue with power creep for RPGs, and the gap between early and late game players becomes massive. However, of course, I am getting ahead of myself. To really understand what this video is about, we need to talk about something else: dungeons. Of course, when Dungeons was announced, it was very exciting. It looked awesome to a lot of players, however, it took a lot longer to come out than expected. But that's not the problem with it. The problem is that after it was announced, players began to prep. Quick disclaimer, some of the things I say in this video will be opinion and not fact, and this is one of those sections. In my opinion, the way Dungeons was announced is what killed it. A lot of players knew that there would be classes, and many people could experience the full thing on the alpha server, and so a lot of people began prepping for the gear that they would use. I know plenty of people that had full setups for every single class that was announced, and I actually myself had a pretty decent healer setup, or so I thought it would be. That is until we learned that you had to have the required kata level to be able to use dungeonized gear. And this was one of the original problems with Dungeons for me. After Dungeons was released, a lot of people immediately began getting pushed away. While many people say that this is because of secrets, in my opinion, it is much more because of the disappointment associated with preparing for weeks and then not being able to effectively use any of it. Personally, I spent a ton of time grinding out revs so that I could use a Reaper Mask and an Ornate Zombie Sword. And I remember a very specific experience where I dungeonized my Ornate Zombie Sword and then was very disappointed because I realized I couldn't use it until Kata 25. At least for me, this is what pushed me away from Dungeons at the beginning, and began the largest split in the community. After Dungeons had been released for some time and many players experienced the same disappointment or other similar disappointments that I did, the community effectively split along the axis of whether or not you played Dungeons. At least in my experience, a very large portion of the community at this time just entirely did not touch Dungeons. Although it was largely supposed to be a late game endeavor, almost nobody that I really knew played Dungeons. There were a few people, and most of us made fun of those people because not only was it infuriating to not be able to use the gear that you had spent time grinding for, there was also relatively little incentive. At least in my opinion, Dungeons really wasn't that useful at the beginning, because not only did it not make a ton of money, most people still cared about skill average far more than they cared about catacombs level or class average. Of course, nowadays, that's not quite the case. Over time, as the community split more and more along the axis of whether or not you played Dungeons, it became harder for those who didn't to catch up, because it required a higher and higher catacombs level to get into the decent parties. Personally, up until the release of around Floor 5, I couldn't care less about what was happening within the Dungeons community, and that's because all of the gear that I had was basically the best you could get. It was max superior and a maxed AOTD, and nothing could really pass that, until the release of Shadow Assassin armor and the Livid Dagger. Although Shadow Assassin was only arguably better than superior and the Livid Dagger didn't make huge waves in the market, that is when players began to realize that if this was Floor 5, imagine the consequences of Floor 10. With the release of these, we began to see what had been happening in the community for a while begin to spike, and that was panic selling. Panic selling had been happening as long as dungeon items had been released, because people realized that their old items would soon be outclassed by their dungeon counterparts. And this really began to spike when Floor 5 was released, because people realized that Superior and a 50mm Midas would soon become next to nothing. When players were thinking that their overworld items would soon be outclassed by their dungeon counterparts, they assumed that it would be around floors 9 and 10. That is all until Floor 7 was released. The release of Floor 7 was less of a power creep and more of a power sprint, because these new items outclassed the old ones by so much that they put them to shame. And of course, the epitome of this is the Hyperion. On its release, the Hyperion outclassed every single other mage weapon in the game in terms of DPS and utility, and was one of the best, if not the best, melee DPS weapons in the entire game as well. This fact, coupled with the Necron handle's extreme rarity, meant that players who could get and sell Necron handles would make billions of coins. And billions of coins they did make. I know plenty of players who made their entire net worths, or a vast majority of it, just within the first couple weeks or months of Floor 7's release. Despite all of this, these are not truly what made the Hyperion problematic. Most of these are just issues with the portion of the player base who chose to not play dungeons, and although admins could have designed around it, it is really not any fault of theirs. The real problem with the Hyperion was a combination of its high levels of exclusivity, combined with the fact that it was just so unbelievably powerful that it halted game development for months after it had been released. The issue is here. The Hyperion was unbelievably powerful. It outclassed almost all other forms of DPS on release by many times over, inside and outside of dungeons alike. This meant that should they want to add any new combat opportunities outside of dungeons, they either would have to make it so difficult that any players without a Hyperion would be one-tapped, or so easy that any players with a Hyperion could easily breeze through the entire content with no challenges. With the Hyperion in its original state, there really were no in-betweens. This problem was accentuated even more within dungeons. Should you want to join a good party, you better have a Hyperion. But how should you get the money to get said Hyperion? Oh, well, just play dungeons. And the problem loops. Of course, the answer to players who were complaining about this was, well, you should have started playing dungeons earlier, and that truly was the answer. But not all of the community enjoyed playing dungeons, and that is really where the problem began. The Hyperion's issues rippled on for months after its release. I spoke to a very reliable source who told me that Minikloon had said that the Hyperion was the one sole reason that development had been halted for so long. Its power meant that content was extremely hard to make. Although we all understand that hindsight is 20/20, the issues of the Hyperion were known in its time. That begs the question, why didn't they just nerf it? And that brings us back to the issue of exclusivity and cost. On release, the Hyperion was immensely expensive. It still is expensive, but it wasn't quite to the same degree that it was when it was first released. Meaning that should the admins nerf the item that only a small portion of the player base even had access to, they would feel that they had just thrown their money in the trash. This would have felt very unfair to a lot of players, and so that was not quite the right solution. Directly nerfing it also would have just dropped its cost, meaning that those players who had vested so much money in getting it to pay it back would all feel scammed out of their money. Despite that, months later it was in fact nerfed, and it was nerfed in a very strange way, in a way that can only be described in the words of a friend of mine named Forager Redstone. He put it extremely well, saying that it didn't make it feel worse or more challenging, it just made everything feel slower. Although in theory that change may have been healthier for the game in the long run, it can only really be described as dissatisfactory. The Hyperion has had a long chain of issues, and that was only the cherry on the cake. Now that we understand that, you're probably gonna ask, well, what could have been done to fix it? In my opinion, the only way that it really could have been solved was by never adding it in its original state in the first place. With all of that said, I must admit that the Hyperion did not really ruin Hypixel Skyblock. Moreover, the way in which Skyblock was designed was truly what ruined Skyblock. It was a game that was not designed for the longevity that it has experienced and has had to adapt throughout the years in ways that it really was not meant to adapt. It's not really the Hyperion's fault that the game has faced the power creep and content droughts that it has. But nonetheless, we have to ask ourselves, what else could have been done to make this game better? If you've made it all the way to the end of this video, I want to personally give you a huge thank you because these sorts of videos are extremely nerve-wracking for me to post, and I'm very glad that you've appreciated all of it. Also, if you wouldn't mind supporting me in the comment section and joining my Discord server where I'll be doing a ton of giveaways over the next couple of weeks, that would mean the world to me. And subscribing, because if I get to 30k by the end of the year, that would mean a ton, and I would be super, super excited. And with all of that said, I'll see you guys later, and adios.